Hello everyone, Mr. John here from Areteem Institute with this week's Thursday Tidbit, where we're going to be continuing the topic of gerrymandering we introduced a little bit last time as well. Let's get started with an example that was brought up as a question last time. We had a group of 15 sci-fi fans, and those fans were divided in their fandom, right? So we have a lot of arguments about these types of things, but let's just do it for fun right now. We have 9 of them preferring Star Trek, and 6 of them are preferring Star Wars. So we have a division there such that 60% of the fans prefer Star Trek, the other 40% prefer Star Wars. Now, the idea is we're dividing these fans into groups of 3. So we divide them into groups of 3, and then each of those groups of 3 is going to vote, and they're asked whether they prefer Star Trek or Star Wars. Now, the question that we posed last time was we want to explore how these groups can actually give you different behavior than the 60% in total. We can get the 60%. We can divide the groups so that 60% of the groups prefer Star Trek over Star Wars, but we'll show here, and if you haven't thought about this, try to do this quick, pause the video and resume it. We want to show that there's actually other results possible there as well. So let's take a look at a few of these examples. Remember here that we have 9 Star Trek, so let me summarize our people again on the top here. So we have 9 Star Trek fans. Let's just do T. Let's drop the star from both. And we have 6 W's that we are going around in this case. Now, the 60% prefer Star Trek. That's 3/5. This one actually works out nicely. Notice that if we just stick with our groups that prefer the same thing together, so we have all of our groups of Star Trek fans, we have 3 of those groups then, and now we have 6 of the Star Wars fans that are left. We can put them in 2 complete groups. Then we have 3 groups that prefer Star Trek and 2 groups that prefer Star Wars. And we have our 60% as needed. So we have our 60% that prefer Star Trek over Star Wars in this grouping there. Now, the whole point of this, remember though, is that other things are possible as well. So can we come up with a grouping where 80% prefer Star Trek? 80% of the groups. All right, we can't change the people. The people are stuck in this case. Now, the key here is that we don't actually need 3 people in a group to prefer Star Trek for Star Trek to win the vote. And this is how we can see that the groupings can be manipulated a little bit. So what happens if we put 2 people that prefer Star Trek in a bunch of groups? So here now, we're dominating as many groups as possible with a majority. So here is our 80%. We have 1 more Star Trek person. And then the 6 Star Wars people, a lot of them are going to be in groups that are outnumbered, right? So here we have these first 4 all prefer Star Trek. So let me just do check marks for those there. So this prefers Star Trek at the top. This one does, this one does, this one does. And so this is how we get our 80% here. So that is what we have in this case. 80% prefer Star Trek in this scenario. Now, of course, this isn't the only thing that can happen. Let's look at one final example here. Can we actually do the reverse? And this is the one that I think is a little bit more interesting because now we are actually switching the majority, right? If you said 60% versus 80%, still more of the groups preferred Star Trek. we can actually swap this to the other end. We can actually have most of the groups preferring Star Wars. Now the strategy, let's do this in a similar way, right? The strategy is just to put 2 Star Wars fans in each of 3 groups. Then the rest of the groups all are filled, or the rest of the people are all filled with Star Trek fans. And this is another good example to look at because, right, we're showing that the amount you win a group by doesn't matter, right? Only these 2 bottom groups prefer Star Trek. Does it matter that those votes are unanimous? No. They still win that group. In the other groups, there's 1 Star Trek, 2 Star Wars fans, and here we have our 40% result in this case. So this is where we can see the way you do this grouping matters a little bit in this scenario. Okay, so let's keep in mind our 9 Star Trek, 6 Star Wars. We're going to use that for the rest of this video quick as well. But the real way this is done in practice, in the real world, is that these things are at least done by location, right? If you're doing groups like that, you might say, okay, you could randomly pick the groups, that would make it fair, or why are you doing the groups anyway, right? But this might be something like, okay, let's suppose those 15 fans are in 5 different states, right? So a couple of people meet up in each state and then they Zoom together to talk as a group of 15 in total, right? So this is how some of these things actually work. You might group them by neighborhoods in a city or states in a country. And so when we're typically doing these groups, they would be done by geographic location. So let's think of these 15 people then in a 3x5 grid. So they're no longer just people we can shuffle around however we want. Every person is going to be in a location on this grid. And then when we do our groupings, we want those groupings to quote unquote make sense when we're talking about that location on a grid. Now, just to show why these things are a little bit interesting and it's not as obvious as you may think, right? Even in a simple example like this, what is a natural way to divide into 5 groups? Well, here we have a pretty natural way. We have a 3x5 grid. We want 5 groups. So how about we group them vertically in these columns like this here? Now, just to show why this is more complicated in general, right? Are you going to actually have a nice 3x5 grid and you want to divide this into 5 groups always? No. What if we wanted to divide this into 4 groups? Then some weirder things would need to happen. What if we needed 6 groups? What if our shape was a circle? What if our shape was a, right, parallelogram, or we had, you know, a shape where we had a rectangle and 2 little rectangles popping up on the ends and stuff, right? If we're looking at actual city shapes or state shapes or country shapes, it's never as simple as we have here. Now, even in a simple example like this, however, you might say and ask, are there any issues that could arise? Well, remember, everything actually does depend where our people are located. So let's even do a very simple way of arranging the Star Trek and Star Wars people. So let's see that right now. So here we have our Star Trek, Star Wars. Now, what happens if we do our groups, right? We have our 5 groups here. Well, the first group, 2-to-1, prefers Star Trek. Second group prefers Star Trek. Third group prefers Star Trek. Fourth group also prefers Star Trek. We also only have 1 group that prefers Star Wars there. So we would have 80% in this case prefer Trek in this scenario. Now, again, I'm not saying this is good or bad, right? This is a fairly natural way to order and divide the groups. You might say, right, if you voted beforehand, right, here's our 3x5 grid, how do we divide these into groups? I would argue that this is probably a natural way to do it, right? We have a systematic way, and you could say that's fairly fair in this scenario. It doesn't match the groups perfectly, right? We have more groups preferring Star Trek than in the actual real world, but right, in a lot of ways that might make sense. In our state example, right, if these were 5 different states, then it does make sense to say 80% of the states prefer Star Trek. That does make sense, and as long as you have a sensible way of doing those groupings, oftentimes things work out in that way. Now, getting finally to exactly what gerrymandering is. And now with some examples, we can show and explain this a little bit easier. So the location of the people can affect the outcomes, right? So depending on how you group this, depending on where the people are, different things can change. So, right, what is gerrymandering? Well, in practice, we might roughly know how people would vote based on their location, right? So suppose we did this once, right? We have those 15 people arranged in our grid. We know, okay, the top rows are more likely to prefer Star Trek to Star Wars. The bottom rows are more likely to prefer Star Wars over Star Trek, right? Then what makes this all interesting, or where problems can arise, is that you can use this information to influence the results, right? You might then say, okay, well, we're going to have a new meeting this time. How do we want to divide up the people? And then with that information, right, you could maybe decide how to change the way you're going to divide the grid and influence the results based on that there. So let's see an example of this, right? So let's say, can we put Star Trek in the minority of the groups by looking at this grid here as well? Now, this isn't even going to be too crazy of a grid, but remember, our goal here was 2-to-1 prefer Star Wars. So what if we take these 2 Star Wars fans right here, put them with 1 Star Trek fan? Now that is a group of 3 that prefers Star Wars, right? There's lots of ways you could do this here, but let's just kind of follow this pattern. We have these 2 Star Wars fans, put them with 1 Star Trek fan, and then these 2 Star Wars fans and 1 Star Trek fan there. So right off the bat there, we have our 3 groups that prefer Star Wars. Then we have this group here and this group here. Right, so just summarizing, this top group prefers Star Trek. This group right here also prefers Star Trek, but the other 3 groups we have prefer Star Wars in this case. So those there, then we have, right, 60% prefer Star Wars in this scenario. That was different than our general population. And this would be a very, very simple example, possibly of gerrymandering, right? Because there's always different ways you could do this, right? Maybe if this is a city, the neighborhoods are actually laid out in this way. That's why these things are much more complicated than this in practice. But right, knowing where the people are located and what votes they might have allow us to change things up, allow us to do possibly weird things with the outcomes from there, and that is the whole idea behind gerrymandering. In fact, there's a lot of interesting things that comes up with voting. What's the best way to vote? How would you divide people fairly? Right? Let us know in the comments if you want to see more videos in the future on some of those topics. That will do it though for this video. There is a new topic coming next week with an intro, so stay tuned for that. Share new ideas, right, whether they're related to some of the things we talked about here with voting or general ideas for new videos and new topics in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, liking it, subscribing really helps us out. Otherwise, I hope to see everyone next week for a new topic. Goodbye.